Okay, so how exactly did a 19th century African princess use poetry to build a completely revolutionary, grassroots educational network of women? Honestly, it sounds like the plot of a historical epic, right? But it is absolutely real. We're talking about a society where mass communication didn't happen through printing presses or the internet, but through the hypnotic, rhythmic power of rhyme.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the extraordinary life of Nana Asma'u. We're going to look at exactly how she leveraged poetry, power, and deeply rooted faith to completely transform the Sokoto Caliphate. If you've ever been curious about how brilliant minds solve massive, societal-level problems with sheer ingenuity, well, you are definitely in the right place.
Here's a quick roadmap of what we'll be covering today. 1. The Sokoto Caliphate. 2. The power of Ajami. 3. Educating the masses. 4. Pleas to saintly women. And finally, 5. An enduring legacy.
All right, let's dive into part 1, the Sokoto Caliphate, a nascent empire. To really get Asma'u's genius, we first have to understand the geopolitical world she was living in. So let's set the stage. In 1754, Asmau's father, the incredibly charismatic scholar Usman Fodio, is born. Fast forward to 1793, and Nana Asma'u herself enters the picture. And from there, things accelerate, like really rapidly. By 1804, her father's congregation asserts its independence from the oppressive state of Gobir, which sparks a movement that ultimately founds the Sokoto Caliphate. From 1810 to 1835, Sokoto enters its main period of expansion. Suddenly, this brand new Islamic empire has to integrate massive numbers of diverse non-Muslim populations. A lot of them were women who had been completely uprooted from their previous religious and cultural connections. This was a logistical and administrative nightmare. And that challenge was compounded by a really severe problem: mass illiteracy, especially among women. Now, Usman Fodio, Asmau's father, he fiercely attacked this issue. He openly called out scholars who would teach their male students but literally leave the women in their households in this perpetual darkness of ignorance. As you can see from his words, he argued that these men treated women like household implements, just used up until they broke and were thrown on the rubbish heap. He envisioned a society where both men and women prioritized education and spiritual growth. And Asma, she inherited that exact visionary mandate.
Which brings us to Section 2, the power of Ajami, a brilliant innovation.
Think about it. You've got this vast new empire, a super diverse population, and a mandate to educate them all. But how do you actually reach everyday people when books are scarce and the main language of scholarship is Arabic, a language most everyday folks just didn't speak? Well, the solution was something called Ajami. Basically, Ajami is the practice of writing local African languages, like Fulfulde or Hausa, using the Arabic alphabet. For Asma'u and her family, this wasn't just some linguistic quirk, it was a vital, game-changing technological tool for mass communication.
What we're looking at here is an actual centuries-old Ajami manuscript. By taking the familiar Arabic script, which was already being taught for basic religious purposes, and applying it to the local languages people actually spoke at home or in the market, the scholars could suddenly bridge the massive gap between high academia and the rural, unlettered public. It was a brilliant strategic pivot. Arabic stayed the language of the scholarly elite, the diplomats, the higher courts. But Fulfulde and Hausa, that was for the people. By translating complex Islamic theology, history, and law into those local languages using Ajami, they were literally democratizing knowledge. They took education out of those exclusive academic bubbles and put it right into the hands of the masses.
Her father actually summed up this tactical mindset perfectly. He said, "When we compose it in Fulfulde, the unlettered also gain." Right? They didn't just want a few smart scholars at the top. They wanted to transform the entire populace. And Nana Asma'u was about to take this tool and spin it into a full-blown 19th century grassroots revolution.
Okay, let's move to Section 3, educating the masses, the Yan Tajero.
This is where we see Asma'u's incredible organizational prowess shine. In 1840, she established a formal network called the Yan Taru to systematically educate women. So how did it work? It was an incredibly smart peer-to-peer system. Step 1, Asma'u writes these instructional, didactic poems in local languages. Step 2, she trains a dedicated group of female teachers, called judges, who memorize the poems word for word. Step 3, these judges travel around and teach other women in the privacy of their own homes. And this part is key, it completely bypassed the critics who didn't want women gathering publicly with men. Finally, step 4, once the students could flawlessly recite the poetry, they were taught to write it down in the Arabic script, which effectively opened the door to reading the Quran itself.
And get this, Asmau totally understood the power of visual branding. Her teachers, the Jajis, wore a distinctive hijab called the malfa. It wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was a highly visible badge of authority and education. When a woman wearing a malfa showed up in a village, everyone instantly knew she represented the central administration of Sokoto. It was a massive flex that instantly elevated women to the status of recognized intellectual stakeholders.
Let's jump into Section 4, Plea to Saintly Women, Art as Instruction. To really appreciate this system, you've got to look at the art itself. Asmau didn't think learning should just be dry facts. In 1837, she wrote a masterpiece called A Plea to Saintly Women. Take a listen to these translated lines. Notice the rhythm, the rhyme. In an oral culture, that hypnotic musicality was basically advanced mnemonic tech. If a poem enchants you, it is so much easier to memorize. She used cadence as memory pegs to foster community and to teach.
Let's unpack the absolute genius behind this specific poem. Her brother, who was the caliph at the time, had written this pretty standard, dry prose manual about societal expectations for women. He asked Asma'u to versify it, but she didn't just translate it, she totally rewrote it to focus entirely on female potential. She wove in stories of the Prophet Muhammad's companions alongside stories of recently deceased local West African women. By doing that, she linked her immediate community to this grand historical sisterhood. She made the poem an active, intimate prayer that sparked wonder and inspired her students.
And finally, Section 5, An Enduring Legacy, the Impact of Nana Asma'u.
As we wrap up this explainer, we really need to highlight the massive footprint she left behind. She wasn't just a sister or a daughter to powerful men, she was a visionary leader, full stop. She outlived both her father and brother, acting as the steadying, deeply respected anchor for the caliphate for decades. She painstakingly cataloged all of her father's works to save his legacy. She wrote dozens of her own profound manuals. And above all, through the Yantar-Yun, she empowered generations of women to be the primary educators of their children and vital pillars of their society.
And her legacy isn't just stuck in the past. This blew my mind. In 1978, literally well over a century after she died, an Islamic scholar recorded a woman in Nigeria singing this incredibly elaborate, lengthy elegy dedicated to Asmau. The poem talked about how the community was just totally overwhelmed with grief when she passed. The fact that this complex, multi-layered poetry was still being actively sung from memory in the late 20th century, that tells you everything you need to know about how deeply embedded her educational and spiritual legacy is in West African culture. Which brings us to our final thought. Nana Asma'u looked at a fractured, unlettered society and realized the only way to move forward was to meet people exactly where they were. She used their own language and the captivating power of poetry to totally bypass social barriers. So if a 19th century poet could revolutionize an entire empire's educational system with just rhyme, local dialects, and sheer dedication, how can we use accessible, engaging communication to empower our own communities today? Think about that as you go about your day. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep learning.